The distress signal pierced through the cosmic void like a needle through silk, carrying with it the desperate pleas of a dying civilization. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Council pressed his elongated fingers against the crystalline communication array, his luminescent blue skin flickering with anxiety as the message played for the 7th time that solar cycle. This is Commander Lyra of the Asterian Defense Fleet. Our homeworld is under siege by the Vorthak Empire. They have broken through our orbital defenses and are systematically destroying our cities. Estimated civilian casualties exceed 200 million and rising. We have exhausted our military reserves, and our allies have withdrawn their support. This may be our final transmission. We are a peaceful species with no history of aggression, yet we face extinction simply because we refuse to surrender our mining rights to the Vorthak. If any civilized species receives this message, we beg of you, remember us. Remember that we tried to stand for what was right. The transmission ended with the sound of explosions in the background and what could only be described as the collective wail of a species watching their world burn. Kethvar's secondary hearts clenched as he turned to address the emergency session of the Galactic Council. Representatives from 47 different species filled the vast chamber, their various forms creating a tapestry of evolutionary diversity that had taken millions of years to achieve. Honored delegates, Kethvar began, his voice carrying the weight of impending doom. This is the 15th world the Vorthak have conquered in the past 2 standard years. Each time we have deliberated, debated, and ultimately decided that intervention would cost too many lives. Each time, we have chosen the path of calculated preservation over moral imperative. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of clicks, chirps, growls, and telepathic emanations as representatives voiced their positions. The crystalline hegemony's speaker, a being of pure, living mineral, resonated with disapproval. The Vorthak possess weapons that can crack planets. Their fleet numbers in the thousands. Even our combined forces would struggle against such overwhelming power. High Priestess Velterra of the Luminous Collective floated above her delegation, her ethereal form pulsing with golden light. The mathematics are clear. A direct confrontation would result in casualties numbering in the billions across our member worlds. We cannot sacrifice the many for the few, regardless of how tragic their situation may be. Tragic. The voice came from Representative Thorek of the Iron Ring Confederation, his mechanical exoskeleton whirring as he stood to his full 3-meter height. We sit here in our comfortable chambers while an entire species is being eradicated, and you call it tragic? Where is our honor? Where is our duty to protect the innocent? The debate raged for hours, following familiar patterns that had played out 14 times before. The pragmatists argued for preservation of their own species. The militarists demanded action, but lacked sufficient support. The isolationists suggested withdrawing from the affected sectors entirely. And, through it all, the Asterian distress signal continued to loop, a constant reminder of lives being lost while they deliberated. Finally, Grand Chancellor Mordun of the Central Authority called for order with a sound that resembled thunder rolling across mountain peaks. His ancient form, covered in scales that had witnessed the rise and fall of 3 galactic civilizations, commanded respect from even the most heated opponents. We have heard all positions. The motion to provide military assistance to the Asterians has failed by a margin of 32 to 15. The matter is closed. As delegates began to file out of the chamber, Kethvar remained at his station, continuing to monitor the increasingly desperate transmissions from Asteria Prime. The city-sized orbital bombardment platforms of the Vorthak were working their way systematically across the planet's surface. Mountain ranges that had stood for millions of years were being reduced to rubble. Oceans were beginning to boil under concentrated energy beams. Perhaps we should consider alternative solutions, came a quiet voice from behind him. Kethvar turned to CDR. Elena Vasquez, the sole representative from a recently contacted species called humans. Unlike most council members who had been part of the galactic community for millennia, humanity had only made first contact 18 standard months ago. They were still considered a primitive species by most standards, having barely achieved faster-than-light travel and possessing technology that was laughably outdated compared to council standards. Alternative solutions? Kethvar asked, genuinely curious. The human female was small by galactic standards, standing barely 1.7 meters tall, with a fragile-looking frame that seemed like it would break under the gravity of most civilized worlds. Her species was young, having only recently crawled out of what they called their Stone Age, compared to the millions of years of development most council species had enjoyed. "My people have a saying," Dr. Vasquez continued, her dark eyes reflecting an intensity that Kethvar found unsettling. "When you can't go through something, you go around it. The council has decided that direct military confrontation is too costly. But what if there were other options? The Vorthak Empire commands the largest fleet in known space," Kethvar replied, his tone gentle but firm. "They have conquered 17 systems in the past decade alone. Their technology is centuries ahead of most council member species. What could your people possibly offer that our combined civilizations cannot?" Dr. Vasquez smiled, and something about that expression made Kethvar's skin cells contract involuntarily. "We're what you might call specialists in impossible situations. Our entire evolutionary history has been one long series of impossible challenges that somehow got solved anyway. Ice ages that should have killed us. Predators that should have eaten us. Diseases that should have wiped us out. Natural disasters that should have ended our species before it began. I fail to see how surviving natural disasters translates to space combat," Kethvar said, though something in the human's tone suggested he was missing important context. "Let me tell you about my world, Ambassador," Dr. Vasquez said, settling into the chair beside his communication station. "Earth is what we call a death world. 98% of all species that have ever lived on our planet are extinct, not because of warfare or conquest, but because the planet itself tries to kill everything on it on a regular basis. We have storms that can level cities, earthquakes that crack continents, volcanoes that can change global weather patterns, and that's just the geological stuff." She paused, pulling up a holographic display from her portable data unit. Images of Earth filled the space between them, showing landscapes that made Kethvar's photosynthetic patches recoil in horror. Massive storms with wind speeds that would strip the atmosphere from most planets. Mountain ranges thrust upward by tectonic forces that could crush starships. Oceans filled with predators that had evolved specifically to kill and consume other life forms. "Then, there's the biology," she continued, seemingly oblivious to Kethvar's growing alarm. "Everything on our world evolved to either kill something else or avoid being killed. Our food chains are pyramids of violence stretching back hundreds of millions of years. We domesticated wolves, Ambassador. Do you know what wolves are?" Kethvar shook his head, mesmerized by the horrifying beauty of the images. Pack hunters with jaw strength capable of crushing bone, descended from creatures that hunted megafauna across ice sheets. We looked at these apex predators and decided they would make good pets. We've been living alongside creatures that could tear our throats out for over 15,000 years, and we call them our best friends. The implications were beginning to dawn on Kethvar. Most civilized species had evolved on garden worlds, places where natural selection had been relatively gentle, allowing for the development of complex societies and technologies. The idea of a species evolving under constant threat was both fascinating and terrifying. "But surely your species must be naturally peaceful now," he protested. "You've developed space travel, formed a planetary government, made contact with galactic civilization. Surely you've moved beyond primitive survival instincts." Dr. Vasquez's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that Kethvar suddenly realized were designed for tearing meat. "Ambassador, we achieved space travel while simultaneously fighting a global war that killed over 60 million of our own people. We split the atom and immediately used it to destroy 2 cities. We've never stopped fighting, we've just gotten better at it." She brought up another series of images, these showing human military conflicts throughout their history. Kethvar watched in growing horror as primitive humans wielding metal weapons fought battles involving millions of participants. Then came images of their more recent conflicts, showing weapons of mass destruction that could glass entire continents. "The thing about Deathworlders," Dr. Vasquez said conversationally, "is that we don't see impossible odds the same way other species do. When someone tells us something can't be done, our first instinct isn't to accept that limitation. Our first instinct is to figure out how to do it anyway, usually through methods that no sane species would consider." "What exactly are you proposing?" Kethvar asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. The Asterians need help. The Council has decided that conventional assistance is too risky. But humans didn't get where we are by using conventional methods. Give us the technical specifications of Vorthack military assets, star charts of their fleet positions, and anything else you can share about their capabilities. And then what? Your species has barely achieved interstellar travel. You have no significant fleet, no advanced weapons, no experience with galactic-scale warfare. Dr. Vasquez stood up, her small frame somehow seeming more substantial than it had moments before. And that, Ambassador, is exactly why we might succeed where everyone else would fail. The Vorthack have spent centuries perfecting defenses against civilized warfare tactics. They've never faced anything like humans. As she gathered her data unit and prepared to leave, she turned back one final time. Oh, and Ambassador, you should probably know that we weren't entirely honest about our reasons for seeking Council membership. We didn't just want to join galactic civilization. We wanted to make sure we understood exactly who our neighbors were before we started expanding our territory. The implications of that statement hung in the air long after Dr. Vasquez had left the chamber. Kethvar found himself staring at the continuing stream of distress signals from Asteria Prime, but now his mind was racing with possibilities he had never considered before. The galaxy had always operated according to certain rules, certain limitations, certain assumptions about what was possible and what was not. But perhaps those assumptions have been based on dealing with civilized species. Perhaps the arrival of humanity represented something entirely new in galactic affairs. As the last transmission from the Asterian homeworld faded into static, Kethvar made a decision that would either save a dying species or unleash something into the galaxy that it was utterly unprepared for. He began drafting a message to the human delegation, requesting an immediate private meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest. As he worked, one thought kept echoing in his mind. When faced with an impossible problem, sometimes the solution was to find someone who didn't understand that it was impossible. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when Deathworlders decided that someone needed saving. Captain Sarah Chun stood on the observation deck of a UES Indomitable, watching the stars streak past as her ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Asteria system. Behind her, the rest of the human fleet materialized from the interdimensional void like predators emerging from tall grass. 15 vessels in total, each one a testament to humanity's unique approach to engineering problems that other species considered unsolvable. The Indomitable itself exemplified human military philosophy. Where most galactic civilizations built their warships according to elegant mathematical principles, seeking perfect balance between offense, defense, and efficiency, humans had taken a different approach. The ship looked like it had been assembled by a committee of madmen with unlimited resources and a complete disregard for conventional physics. Its primary hull was a patchwork of armor plating salvaged from decommissioned terrestrial fortifications, welded together with advanced metamaterials that could absorb and redistribute kinetic impacts across the entire structure. Weapons systems jutted from the hull at seemingly random angles, each one designed for a specific tactical scenario that human military planners had deemed probably going to happen eventually. Long-range sensors are picking up the Vorthack fleet, reported Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos from the bridge below. Her voice carried through the ship's communication system with the crisp efficiency that had made the human military legendary among their own kind. Confirmed positions match intelligence data provided by Ambassador Kethvar. 237 vessels in standard siege formation around Asteria Prime. Captain Chun smiled grimly as she made her way to the bridge. The past 72 hours have been a whirlwind of preparation, as humanity's finest military minds worked around the clock to develop tactics for a scenario that, by all conventional understanding, should have been suicide. The Vorthack fleet outnumbered the human force by more than 15 to 1, possessed superior technology, and had centuries of experience in interstellar warfare. But then again, humans had never been particularly concerned with conventional understanding. Communications, open a channel to the fleet, Chun ordered as she settled into her command chair. Around her, the bridge hummed with the controlled chaos of a human military operation. Unlike the serene, automated bridges of other galactic civilizations, human warships required constant input from their crews. Every system had multiple manual overrides, Every weapon could be fired independently of the main targeting computer, and every critical function could be performed by hand if necessary. "Channel open, Captain," reported Ensign Torres, his fingers dancing across a control panel that looked like it had been designed by someone who assumed that elegant simplicity was a luxury they couldn't afford. "All ships, this is Captain Shun. Operation Deathworld Diplomacy is now active. You have your individual target assignments and tactical parameters. Remember, we're not here to win a conventional engagement. We're here to make the Vorthak Empire regret every decision that led them to this moment. Execute Phase 1. Across the human fleet, similar scenes played out as captains briefed their crews on what was about to happen. The plan they had developed was so far outside normal tactical doctrine that most galactic civilizations would have dismissed it as the ravings of a disturbed artificial intelligence. But humans had learned long ago that when facing impossible odds, the key was to make sure your enemy was facing odds that were even more impossible. Admiral Jackson aboard the UES Retribution addressed his crew over the ship's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to demonstrate why humans are considered apex predators on our homeworld. The Vorthak think they understand warfare because they've conquered a few Garden World civilizations. They're about to learn the difference between fighting gardeners and fighting something that evolved to kill everything else on its planet." The first phase of Operation Deathworld Diplomacy began with what appeared to be a completely conventional attack run. The 15 human vessels accelerated toward the Vorthak siege line, weapons powering up and shields at maximum strength. To the Vorthak commanders watching their approach, it must have looked like yet another desperate last stand by inferior beings who didn't understand the futility of their situation. General Krexthul, commanding the Vorthak siege fleet from his massive dreadnought Worldbreaker, watched the approaching human ships with the kind of bored contempt that came from decades of crushing similar attempts at heroic intervention. His flagship alone massed more than the entire human fleet combined, and his weapons could reduce planets to asteroids. 15 primitive vessels, he rumbled to his tactical officer, his voice carrying the grinding authority of a species that had built an empire on the simple principle that might made right. They cannot possibly believe they can challenge the might of the Vorthak Empire. This will be over in moments. But as the human fleet entered weapons range, something unexpected happened. Instead of opening fire or attempting to break through the siege line, the ships suddenly scattered in 15 different directions, each one following what appeared to be a completely random trajectory. Some dove toward the planet's surface, others climbed toward the system's outer reaches, and several seemed to be heading directly into the local star's gravity well. "What are they doing?" Krexthul demanded, his tactical displays struggling to track the wildly divergent flight paths. "Are they fleeing? Have they lost their minds?" The answer came 30 seconds later when the UES Indomitable, instead of engaging the siege fleet, plunged directly into Asteria Prime's upper atmosphere at a trajectory that should have resulted in its immediate destruction. The ship's hull began to glow cherry red as it fought atmospheric friction, its ungainly armor plating somehow managing to dissipate the thermal energy without catastrophic failure. "Sir," his tactical officer reported with growing alarm, "that vessel is performing an atmospheric combat insertion. At those speeds, with that mass, the impact should destroy them, but their trajectory suggests they intend to survive it." Krexthul watched in disbelief as the human ship deployed what could only be described as controlled crash procedures. Massive atmospheric brakes extended from the hull, creating drag forces that would have torn apart any sensibly designed vessel. Emergency thruster clusters fired in sequence, bleeding off momentum in violent bursts that painted the sky with brief artificial stars. The Indomitable struck the surface of Asteria Prime like a controlled meteor, its impact sending shockwaves through the ground that registered on seismic equipment across half the continent. But instead of creating a crater and a cloud of vaporized metal, the ship somehow survived its landing and immediately began deploying ground forces. "Impossible," Krexthul breathed, but his disbelief was interrupted by urgent reports from across his fleet. "General, we have multiple human vessels performing similar maneuvers. They're landing combat teams on the planet's surface, but, sir, the locations make no tactical sense. They're not targeting our ground installations or attempting to reach population centers. Then what are they targeting? The answer became clear over the next hour as human ground teams established positions at seemingly random locations across Asteria Prime surface. But the locations weren't random at all. Each team had been deployed at critical points in the planet's geological structure, places where seismic activity was most vulnerable to artificial stimulation. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now wearing combat armor that looked like it had been designed by someone who expected to fight in the depths of hell, supervised the placement of specialized charges in a cavern system beneath the planet's largest mountain range. Her team of combat engineers worked with the kind of casual efficiency that came from practicing similar operations on every type of hostile terrain Earth had to offer. Seismic charges are in position, she reported to Captain Shun through her helmet comm system. Geological survey confirms that detonation will trigger a controlled landslide that will take out the primary Vorthack mining operation without damaging civilian areas. Similar reports came in from teams across the planet. Humans, it turned out, had spent thousands of years learning how to use their own hostile environment as a weapon. They understood weather patterns, geological instabilities, and ecological vulnerabilities in ways that species from gentler worlds could never comprehend. But the real surprise came when the Vorthack fleet moved to provide orbital support for their ground forces, only to discover that the other human vessels had not fled or hidden themselves. They had positioned themselves at the gravitational balance points throughout the system, places where small actions could have enormous consequences. The UES Retribution had nestled itself next to a cluster of unstable asteroids in the system's outer belt. Using precisely calculated thruster burns, the human ship began nudging asteroids onto new trajectories, sending them cascading toward the inner system in a carefully orchestrated avalanche of stone and metal. The UES Defiant had positioned itself near one of the system's gas giants, where it was using mining charges to destabilize the orbit of several moons. The resulting gravitational chaos would take days to fully develop, but when it did, the moon fragments would create a debris field that would make orbital operations impossible for months. Perhaps most audaciously, the UES Vengeance had actually flown into the local star's corona, its specially modified heat shielding barely keeping the crew alive as they deployed solar magnetic field disruptors. The devices wouldn't damage the star, but they would trigger solar flares that would disrupt communications and sensors across the entire system. What manner of species fights this way? Krexthul demanded, watching his tactical displays fill with cascading system failures and environmental hazards that threatened to make continued military operations impossible. They're using the entire star system as a weapon. His tactical officer could only stare at the readings in disbelief. Sir, our geological teams report that the humans have somehow learned the deep structure of this planet better than our own engineers, despite having been in the system for less than 4 hours. They're triggering targeted natural disasters that are destroying our installations while leaving civilian areas untouched. The scope of what the humans were accomplishing began to sink in. This wasn't just a military engagement, it was environmental warfare on a scale that no galactic civilization had ever conceived. The humans weren't trying to defeat the Vorthack fleet through superior firepower or advanced technology. They were turning the very laws of physics against them, using the natural forces of the star system itself as weapons of war. And they were doing it with the casual competence of a species that had spent millions of years learning to survive on a world that wanted them dead. As reports of system-wide chaos continued to pour in, Krexthul realized that his carefully planned siege operation was falling apart not because of military action, but because 15 human vessels had somehow gained tactical control of an entire star system using principles of warfare that no sane civilization would ever have developed. The humans weren't fighting like any known species. They were fighting like the environment itself had gained consciousness and decided to go to war. The command bridge of the World Breaker shuddered as another cascade of asteroid impacts hammered the ship's shields. General Krexthul gripped his command throne with all 4 of his massive claws, his battle-scarred exoskeleton scraping against the metal as he struggled to comprehend the tactical nightmare unfolding around his fleet. Status report, he bellowed over the cacophony of alarms and emergency notifications that filled the bridge. Sir, we have lost contact with 37 ground installations, his communications officer reported, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. The humans have somehow triggered simultaneous geological events across 14 different continents. Mountain ranges are collapsing. Underground rivers are being redirected to flood our mining operations, and they've started controlled volcanic eruptions that are disrupting our atmospheric processors. Krexthal's primary eyes narrowed to slits as he processed this information. In over 2 centuries of military service, he had conquered 43 worlds and crushed the resistance of dozens of different species. But none of them had ever fought back by weaponizing the planets themselves. "What of our orbital assets?" he demanded. "Worse, sir," replied his tactical coordinator, mandibles clicking in agitation. "The asteroid bombardment they initiated is ongoing. Our predictive computers cannot calculate safe orbital positions because the humans keep altering the trajectories of debris using their ship's engines. They're literally steering an entire asteroid belt at us, using coordinated thruster burns." On the main display, the tactical situation looked like something out of a fever dream. The neat, orderly siege formation that had successfully conquered 17 worlds was dissolving into chaos as Vorthack vessels were forced to continuously adjust their positions to avoid collisions with incoming asteroids, moon fragments, and clouds of metallic debris that seemed to follow impossible trajectories. "And the star?" Krexthal asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The solar magnetic field disruptors the humans deployed are causing massive instabilities in the corona. We're experiencing communication blackouts every 18 minutes when solar flares sweep across our position. Sir, our long-range communications with Vorthack High Command have been completely severed." The implications of that last statement hit the general like a physical blow. Without communication with the Empire, he couldn't request reinforcements, couldn't coordinate with other fleet elements, and couldn't even report on the unprecedented tactics being employed against his forces. For the first time in his military career, Krexthal felt the cold touch of uncertainty. "How many human vessels have we destroyed?" he asked, clinging to the hope that their losses were at least mounting. His weapons coordinator consulted her displays with obvious reluctance. "None, sir. We've targeted them multiple times, but they keep using the environmental chaos they've created as cover. When we fire on their position near the gas giant, they duck behind a moon that they've destabilized. When we target the ship in the corona, solar flares interfere with our weapons guidance. And the ones on the planet's surface have somehow made themselves immune to orbital bombardment. Impossible. No ground force can withstand planetary bombardment. Sir, they're not resisting the bombardment. They're redirecting it. When we fire on their positions, they use shaped charges to channel the energy into underground faults. Our own weapons are being turned into seismic triggers that cause more damage to our installations than theirs." Captain Chun, monitoring the engagement from her position in the cave system beneath Mount Asteria, allowed herself a grim smile as the latest Vorthack bombardment struck the mountain above her team's position. The carefully calculated blast tunnels her engineers had carved channeled the orbital strike's energy directly into a geological weak point, triggering a controlled landslide that buried the largest Vorthack mining complex on the continent, while leaving her team completely unharmed in their reinforced positions. "Damage report," she called out to her team. "Structural integrity holding at 97%, reported Sergeant Rodriguez, consulting readings from sensors embedded in the cave walls. The Vorthack bombardment added approximately 15% more energy to the landslide than our original calculations predicted. The mining complex is now buried under roughly 2 million tons of rock and debris." "Excellent. How are the Asterian civilian evacuations proceeding?" Dr. Vasquez, her armor now covered in a layer of stone dust and mineral deposits, looked up for her geological survey equipment. Local Asterian authorities report that 93% of civilians have been safely evacuated from active combat zones. Apparently, they're amazed that our seismic activities are actually stabilizing some of the fault systems that the Vorthack mining operations destabilized. "We're not just protecting them from current threats, we're making their planet more stable than it was before the invasion." This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human tactical doctrine. Where other species saw environmental warfare as inherently destructive, humans had learned to fight in ways that actually improved the long-term stability of the battlefield. Every avalanche, they triggered removed, unstable rock formations. Every redirected underground river created new irrigation systems. Every controlled volcanic eruption relieved pressure that could have caused more destructive natural disasters later. They weren't just defending Asteria Prime, they were terraforming it into a more defensible position. Meanwhile, in space, Admiral Jackson aboard the UES Retribution was coordinating what could only be described as the galaxy's most violent game of three-dimensional billiards. His ship had spent the past 4 hours using precise thruster burns to nudge asteroids, comets, and planetary debris into increasingly complex orbital patterns around the Vorthack fleet. Trajectory analysis complete, reported his navigation officer, Commander Peterson. The next cascade sequence will begin in approximately 17 minutes. When asteroid cluster Alpha 7 impacts the Vorthack formation, the debris will scatter along vectors that will intersect with Moon Fragment Group Delta 9 approximately 31 minutes later. And the Vorthack response? Predictable, sir. They'll move to avoid the first impact, which will position them directly in the path of the second wave. After that, they'll be forced to either abandon their siege formation entirely or accept massive casualties to their outer patrol vessels. Admiral Jackson nodded, watching the tactical display with the satisfaction of a chess master who had planned 15 moves ahead. Maintain current operations. Continue to make their lives interesting. The human approach to space combat was fundamentally different from anything the galaxy had seen before. Where other species built bigger guns and stronger shields, humans had learned to turn the battlefield itself into a weapon. They didn't need to overpower Vorthack technology because they had made Vorthack technology irrelevant. What good were planet-cracking weapons when the enemy could trigger landslides that redirected your shots? What good were impenetrable shields when asteroids weighing millions of tons were bearing down on you from 17 different directions? What good were advanced sensors when solar flares were blinding your electronics every few minutes? General Krexthul was beginning to understand that his fleet had not engaged a conventional military force. They had somehow provoked something that fought like a natural disaster with tactical intelligence and long-term planning capabilities. Sir, his intelligence coordinator spoke up hesitantly. We've completed our analysis of human combat doctrine based on observed behaviors. The preliminary report is disturbing. Explain. It appears that this species has developed their military tactics by fighting against their own planet's environment for millions of years. Every technique they're using against us corresponds to survival strategies they developed for dealing with natural disasters, hostile weather patterns, and environmental catastrophes on their homeworld. Krexthul stared at the coordinator in disbelief. You're telling me that they learned to fight interstellar wars by fighting their own planet? Not exactly, sir. They learned to fight anything by fighting everything else that lived on their planet. According to the intelligence data provided by Galactic Council sources, Earth is classified as a Class XI death world. The environmental conditions there are so hostile that normal evolution would have resulted in extinction events every few thousand years. The fact that any species survived to develop intelligence on such a world suggests that they evolved specifically to thrive under impossible conditions. The full scope of what they were facing began to crystallize in Krexthul's mind. The Vorthack Empire had built its power by conquering species that had evolved under relatively benign conditions, species that developed civilization through cooperation and technological advancement rather than through constant survival challenges. But humans had evolved under conditions that would have killed any other known sapient species. They hadn't developed technology to make their lives easier. They had developed technology to survive in an environment that was actively trying to kill them. Every tool they created, every tactic they employed, every instinct they possessed had been honed by millions of years of fighting against impossible odds. And now they had turned all of that evolutionary experience into a military doctrine that treated entire star systems as tactical assets. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet, reported the communications officer. Put it through. The voice that came through the speakers was calm, professional, and somehow more unsettling than any battle cry Krexthul had ever heard. General Krexthul, this is Captain Sarah Chun of the United Earth ship Indomitable. We're prepared to discuss terms for your immediate withdrawal from the Asteria system. Terms? Krexthul roared, his pride as a Vorthack warrior flaring. You dare to dictate terms to the Vorthack Empire? We command over 200 vessels. We possess weapons that can shatter worlds. General, Captain Shen's voice replied, with the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to small children. In the past 4 hours, we have demonstrated tactical control over every major gravitational body in this star system, triggered coordinated geological events across an entire planet, and turned your own orbital bombardments into engineering tools for our construction projects. We've done all of this with 15 ships and approximately 3,000 personnel. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Your choices are simple. You can withdraw your fleet now, while you still have ships left to withdraw. Or you can remain in the system while we demonstrate exactly what humans do to species that threaten our allies. And if we choose to fight. The pause that followed was filled with the sound of another cascade of asteroid impacts against vortex shields, punctuated by reports of additional ground installations being buried under precisely triggered landslides. Then, General, you'll learn why humans are the only species in galactic history to achieve spaceflight while simultaneously fighting a global war. You'll discover what it means to face an enemy that evolved by defeating everything else that lived on the most hostile planet in known space. Captain Shen's voice took on a tone that made Krexthul's exoskeleton crawl with instinctive dread. You'll find out what happens when Deathworlders decide that you need to be stopped. The silence that followed Captain Shen's ultimatum stretched across the communication channels like a taut wire. General Krexthul sat in his command throne, processing information that challenged everything he understood about warfare, tactics, and the nature of intelligent life itself. Around him, his bridge crew waited with the barely controlled tension of predators who had suddenly realized they were being hunted. General, his tactical coordinator spoke quietly. Long-range sensors are detecting additional gravitational anomalies throughout the system. The humans appear to be positioning objects for what our computers can only classify as weapons of planetary engineering. The scale of coordination required suggests tactical planning that extends across geological timescales. Krexthul reviewed the data flowing across his personal displays, and what he saw defied rational explanation. The humans weren't just using the current state of the Asterius system as weapons. They were reshaping the fundamental orbital mechanics to create ongoing tactical advantages that would persist for centuries. They were fighting a war that would still be won or lost decades after the current battle ended. Explain these weapons of planetary engineering, he commanded. Sir, they've somehow calculated the precise gravitational influences needed to alter the long-term orbital stability of the entire system. The asteroid redirections they've initiated will create a debris field that will make this system naturally defensible against invasion for the next 200 years. The moon destabilizations will eventually result in a ring system around the gas giant that will serve as an early warning network for any approaching fleets. The implications were staggering. Not only were the humans winning the current engagement, they were ensuring that any future attempts to invade Asteria would face even worse odds. They were playing a strategic game that operated on timescales that most military planners couldn't even comprehend. And the solar modifications? The magnetic field disruptors will cause the star to enter a more active phase that will strengthen the solar wind throughout the system. Combined with the new debris fields, this will create a natural barrier that will interfere with the sensors and communications of any attacking force for approximately 50 to 70 standard years. Krexthul felt something he had never experienced in 2 centuries of military service. The absolute certainty that he was facing an opponent who was not just tactically superior, but who operated according to principles that his own species couldn't even conceptualize. The humans weren't just winning this battle. They were re-engineering the battlefield to ensure that similar battles would be impossible in the future. Sir, we're receiving multiple priority transmissions from across the fleet, reported his communications officer. Fleet captains are requesting permission to withdraw to minimum safe distance. They're reporting that their vessels are suffering structural stress from the constant maneuvering required to avoid environmental hazards. This was perhaps the most humiliating aspect of the engagement. The Vorthack fleet, designed to project overwhelming military force across interstellar distances, was being reduced to ineffectiveness not through direct combat, but through the simple expedient of making it impossible for them to remain in stable positions long enough to coordinate attacks. What is the status of our ground operations? Krexthul asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Complete tactical failures, sir. Our ground commanders report that every attempt to advance on Asterian population centers has been countered by precisely timed natural disasters. When our forces move through mountain passes, avalanches block their progress. When they advance across open terrain, sinkholes open beneath their vehicles. When they attempt aerial assaults, volcanic ash clouds ground their aircraft. The tactical coordinator called up holographic displays showing the surface of Asteria Prime, where Vorthak ground forces were scattered across the landscape in isolated pockets, unable to coordinate or advance because the humans had somehow gained complete control over the planet's geological processes. But, sir, the most disturbing reports come from our engineering teams. They say that the humans aren't just triggering random natural disasters. Every geological event they initiate serves multiple tactical purposes while simultaneously improving the planet's long-term environmental stability. They're fighting us by making Asteria Prime a better place to live. This was the aspect of human warfare that was most incomprehensible to the Vorthak mindset. Every other species the Empire had conquered fought defensively, trying to preserve their world from the damage of military conflict. The humans were conducting military operations that actually enhanced the planet's natural defenses while making it more habitable for its native population. They were terraforming Asteria Prime into a fortress world, while using the terraforming process as a weapon against its invaders. "General," came a new voice from the communications station. "We're receiving a transmission from the Asterian Defense Command. They're requesting permission to coordinate with human ground forces for joint operations against our remaining positions." The irony was bitter. The Vorthak Empire had come to Asteria expecting to face a demoralized and exhausted defense force protecting a dying world. Instead, they found themselves fighting alongside the very people they were trying to conquer against an enemy that was making the planet stronger with every tactical action. "Denied," Krexthol growled, but even as he spoke, he knew that his denial was meaningless. The humans had already accomplished something that no Vorthak military strategist had thought possible. They had turned a conquest scenario into a cooperative defense effort where the invaders were helping the defenders by providing targets for environmental weapons. On the surface of Asteria Prime, Captain Chun watched real-time geological surveys as her latest seismic charges created precisely controlled underground waterways that would provide fresh water to Asterian refugee camps for decades to come. The charges had also, incidentally, triggered a landslide that had buried the largest remaining Vorthak armored division under several million tons of iron, or that the Asterians would be able to mine once the invasion ended. "Captain," reported Sergeant Martinez from his position monitoring Vorthak communications. "Intercepted transmissions indicate that enemy ground commanders are requesting immediate evacuation. They're reporting that their forces are suffering from what they're calling environmental warfare fatigue. Apparently, being constantly threatened by weaponized natural disasters is having severe psychological effects on their troops." Chun nodded, understanding the psychological impact of what they were doing. The Vorthak military was trained to fight enemies they could see and engage directly. Being attacked by the environment itself, by forces that seemed to turn the very ground beneath their feet into an enemy, was breaking down their morale in ways that conventional warfare never could. "Any word from the orbital forces?" "Yes, ma'am. Admiral Jackson reports that the latest asteroid cascade sequence is proceeding ahead of schedule. The Vorthak fleet is being forced to maintain continuous evasive maneuvers, which is preventing them from coordinating orbital bombardments. He estimates that they'll be forced to withdraw to beyond the outer planets within the next 6 hours or risk losing ships to collision damage." Dr. Vasquez approached from her position coordinating with Asterian geological teams. Her armor was now completely covered in mineral dust from a dozen different cave systems, and her helmet's heads-up display showed ongoing seismic readings from across the planet. "Captain, we've completed the deep geological surveys. It turns out that the Vorthak mining operations were destabilizing fault systems that could have caused a major extinction event within the next decade. By triggering controlled releases along those fault lines, we've actually prevented a natural disaster that would have killed millions of Asterians." She pulled up holographic displays showing the planet's deep structure. "The Asterians are calling it a miracle. Not only did we save them from the invasion, we inadvertently saved them from a geological catastrophe they didn't even know was coming." This exemplified the fundamental difference between human and Vorthak approaches to warfare. The Empire conquered through overwhelming force applied with surgical precision, extracting maximum resources while investing minimal effort in understanding or preserving the worlds they claimed. Humans fought by becoming part of the environment they were defending, by understanding it so completely that they could turn it into both weapon and shield simultaneously. Back aboard the Worldbreaker, General Krexthul made the decision that would define the rest of his military career. After reviewing casualty reports, tactical assessments, and long-term strategic projections, he realized that continuing the engagement would not just result in defeat, it would result in the kind of comprehensive disaster that could cripple the Vorthak Empire's expansion for generations. All fleet elements, he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that went against every instinct of his warrior culture. Prepare for immediate withdrawal from the Asteria system. We are discontinuing siege operations and returning to Empire space. Sir, his tactical coordinator protested, our casualties have been minimal. We still command overwhelming numerical superiority. Surely we can adapt our tactics to counter human environmental warfare. Krexthul turned to fix his subordinate with a stare that had intimidated dozens of species across the galaxy. Look at your displays, Commander. Look at what 15 human ships have accomplished in less than 8 hours. They have gained tactical control of an entire star system using principles of warfare that we cannot counter because we cannot understand them. They fight like the universe itself has declared war on us. He gestured toward the tactical displays showing the chaos surrounding his fleet. Even if we eventually defeat them here, they have demonstrated capabilities that make continued expansion into their territory impossible. We would be fighting an enemy that can turn any star system into a weapon pointed at our own fleets. The general paused, considering information that his intelligence teams had compiled about human capabilities and psychology. But more importantly, they have proven that they can make alliance with local populations against us more beneficial than conquest. Every action they take strengthens the worlds they defend. We cannot compete with that using conventional military doctrine. As the Vorthak fleet began its withdrawal from the Asteria system, General Krexthul composed what would become one of the most influential military reports in galactic history. His assessment of human capabilities would fundamentally change how every major power approached the question of contact with the species that had emerged from the death world called Earth. The humans had done something unprecedented in the annals of galactic warfare. They had demonstrated that superior technology and overwhelming numbers could be countered by superior understanding of natural forces and willingness to use any available resource as a tactical asset. They had proven that Death World evolution created not just survivors, but a form of intelligence that could turn survival itself into a weapon of war. Most importantly, they had shown that their concept of victory included making their allies stronger rather than simply making their enemies weaker. This approach to conflict resolution was so foreign to galactic civilization that most military strategists would spend years trying to understand its implications. But for the Asterians, watching Vorthak ships disappear in a hyperspace while their world settled into the most geologically stable configuration in its recorded history, the implications were clear. The Deathworlders hadn't just answered their cry for help. They had transformed their world into something stronger than it had ever been before. 3 months after the Vorthak withdrawal, the Galactic Council chambers had never been so crowded. Representatives from 217 different species packed the vast amphitheater, with additional delegations participating via quantum entanglement communication from across known space. The emergency session had been called to address what historians were already calling the Asteria intervention, but Ambassador Kethvar knew that the real purpose was to figure out what to do about humanity. The official records of the engagement made for sobering reading. 15 human vessels had forced the withdrawal of the largest Vorthak fleet ever assembled, accomplished the complete liberation of an occupied world, and fundamentally altered the strategic balance of power in 3-star systems, all without firing a single conventional weapon at enemy forces. But the unofficial reports were what had prompted this emergency gathering. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy had spent the past 3 months analyzing human tactical doctrine, and their conclusions were causing panic among military leadership of every major power. The humans hadn't just won an impossible victory. They had demonstrated capabilities that render traditional military thinking obsolete. Honored delegates, Kethvar began, his luminescent skin flickering with patterns that conveyed deep unease. We are gathered today to discuss the implications of humanity's intervention in the Asteria crisis. The preliminary reports make it clear that we are dealing with a species unlike any previously encountered in galactic history. Grand Admiral Thexvar of the Hegemony Fleet Command stood to address the assembly, his crystalline form resonating with frequencies that conveyed military authority. The tactical analysis is complete. The humans demonstrated the ability to weaponize fundamental physical forces on a scale that we previously thought impossible. They turned gravity itself into their ally, used stellar mechanics as a communication jamming system, and employed planetary geology as a precision weapons platform. High researcher Yil Eman of the Scientific Collective projected holographic displays showing the current state of the Asteria system. But, perhaps more significantly, their modifications to the system have created what can only be described as a permanent defensive enhancement. The orbital mechanics they established will provide early warning of approaching fleets for centuries. The geological modifications have made the planet naturally resistant to orbital bombardment. They have transformed Asteria Prime into a fortress world using techniques that we cannot duplicate or counter. A ripple of unease spread through the assembly as delegates contemplated the implications. If humans could turn any star system into an impregnable fortress in a matter of hours, what did that mean for the balance of power that had maintained galactic peace for millennia? Representative Corlex of the Trade Federation spoke up, his mechanical voice carriers clicking with agitation. The economic implications are equally disturbing. Human intervention increased Asteria Prime's natural resource accessibility by approximately 300%, while simultaneously making extraction operations impossible for hostile forces. They've created a world that can only be profitably exploited by allies. Which brings us to the central question, interjected Counselor Morthak of the Military Coordination Authority. What do the humans want? Every species in galactic history has sought expansion, resource acquisition, or territorial control. But human actions suggest goals that we cannot categorize using conventional strategic frameworks. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now wearing formal diplomatic attire rather than combat armor, stood to address the assembly. Her small human form seemed almost insignificant among the diverse array of alien representatives. But the chamber fell silent as she began to speak. Honored delegates, I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about human motivations. You're trying to analyze our actions using frameworks based on competition for limited resources. But humans evolved on a world where the primary threat wasn't other species competing for resources. It was the environment itself trying to kill everything that lived on it. She activated a holographic display showing images of Earth's diverse ecosystems. On our world, survival required cooperation between species rather than competition against them. The most successful evolutionary strategies involved finding ways to make the entire ecosystem more stable and productive. We learned that making our environment stronger made us stronger. Ambassador Kethvar leaned forward, his attention completely focused. Are you saying that human military doctrine is based on ecosystem management principles? Essentially, yes. When we see a threat to galactic stability, our instinct isn't to eliminate the threat through superior force. Our instinct is to strengthen the system so that the threat becomes irrelevant. In the Asteria situation, we didn't defeat the Vorthak by destroying their fleet. We made their conquest objectives impossible to achieve by transforming the system into something that couldn't be conquered using their methods. Senator Velterra of the Luminous Collective pulsed with golden light as she processed this information. But surely there must be limits to these capabilities. You cannot simply reshape reality to suit your strategic objectives. Dr. Vasquez smiled with an expression that had become familiar to those who had studied human psychology over the past months. Senator, humans have been reshaping reality to suit our objectives for our entire evolutionary history. We call it technology. The difference is that we developed our technology by learning to work with natural forces rather than against them. She gestured to bring up additional displays showing human engineering projects on Earth. We learned to redirect rivers to prevent floods while generating power. We developed agriculture that actually increases soil fertility rather than depleting it. We built cities that work with weather patterns instead of fighting against them. Every major human achievement has involved making our environment stronger while making ourselves stronger in the process. The implications were staggering. While other species had developed technology to overcome environmental limitations, humans had developed technology to enhance environmental capabilities. They didn't just adapt to their surroundings. They formed partnerships with the fundamental forces of nature itself. This explains their tactical choices at Asteria. Admiral Thexvar observed. They weren't conducting a military campaign. They were performing large-scale environmental engineering with military applications. Grand Chancellor Mordun, ancient beyond the memory of most species present, spoke with the weight of eons behind his words. The question before us is simple. How do we coexist with a species whose very concept of conflict resolution involves making their opponents' objectives impossible rather than making their opponents dead? The answer came from an unexpected source. Commander Lyra of the Asterian Defense Force, the same officer whose desperate transmissions had started the crisis, had been granted special permission to address the Council via quantum communication from Asteria Prime. Honored delegates, her voice carried clearly across the vast chamber. I can speak to what it means to be allied with humans rather than opposed to them. In the 3 months since their intervention, our world has experienced the most productive period in our recorded history. The geological modifications they made have increased our energy production capabilities by 400%. The mineral deposits they exposed will provide resources for centuries. The agricultural improvements resulting from their water management projects have eliminated food scarcity across our entire planet. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of wonder that was unmistakable. But more than that, they've taught us techniques that we're now using to help other worlds in our region. The humans didn't just save Asteria Prime. They gave us the knowledge and capabilities to help save others. They've turned us from victims into rescuers. This revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. The humans hadn't just demonstrated superior tactical capabilities. They had created a force multiplier that could spread their environmental engineering techniques across the galaxy through allied species. The military implications are obvious, stated General Corexthul of the Vorthak Empire, who had requested special permission to attend the session. Every world that allies with humanity becomes stronger and more defensible. Every world that opposes them becomes a target for environmental warfare that we cannot effectively counter. The strategic balance of the galaxy is shifting toward cooperative defense alliances rather than competitive military expansion. Dr. Vasquez nodded in acknowledgement. General Corexthul understands the situation correctly. Humans prefer to solve problems through cooperation rather than conquest, but we're very good at making conquest unprofitable for those who choose that path. Ambassador Kethvar synthesized the discussion into a formal proposal. It seems clear that humanity represents a fundamental change in galactic strategic thinking. The question is whether we adapt to work with this change or attempt to contain it. The debate that followed would continue for days, but the outcome was perhaps inevitable. Species after species stood to report intelligence assessments that reached the same conclusion. Humans had demonstrated capabilities that made traditional military conquest obsolete as a tool of galactic policy. More importantly, they had shown that cooperation with humanity provided benefits that no amount of military conquest could achieve. The final vote was remarkably unanimous. Resolution 2157 Alpha established humanity as a galactic stabilization partner, with authority to intervene in conflicts where environmental warfare might provide alternatives to conventional military solutions. The resolution also established the Cooperative Defense Initiative, a new framework for mutual aid that was based on the principle of making allied systems stronger rather than simply deterring aggressors. Dr. Vasquez accepted the resolution on behalf of humanity with a simple statement that would be quoted in history texts for millennia to come. Humans learned long ago that the best way to win a fight is to make sure that nobody wants to fight you. We look forward to teaching the galaxy better ways to solve its problems. As delegates filed out of the chambers, Many were still grappling with the realization that their species' expansion into the cosmos had been fundamentally altered by contact with a single world that had produced survivors so effective that they had turned survival itself into an art form. The Asterian distress signal had reached across the void, calling for help from anyone who might hear it. It had been answered by a species that didn't just rescue the desperate. They transformed them into rescuers themselves. The cry that had resonated through the stars had been answered by Deathworlders who believed that the best response to a cry for help was to ensure that such cries would never need to be made again. And across the galaxy, on worlds that had never heard of Earth or Asteria Prime, beings looked up at their stars and wondered if perhaps, somewhere in the vast darkness, there were allies they had never dared to imagine. Allies who fought by making their friends stronger rather than their enemies weaker. Allies who had learned, in the crucible of the most hostile world in known space, that the greatest victories were won not through superior force, but through superior understanding of the forces that shaped the universe itself. The Deathworlders had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same.